Hey viewers, my name's Kara. I'm your host for Tuesdays here on the Pagan Perspective, and this week we're talking about ancestors. I actually love the fact that we got questions about ancestors and the Fae back to back, so we're talking about the Fae next week, because ancestors and Fae are two things that are involved in the reclaiming tradition that were kind of newer things that I hadn't really currently been integrating into my path very much. So it's something that both of them are things that I have only recently begun to try to incorporate more into my path. So this is perfect. So this week we're talking about ancestor veneration and how you can incorporate honoring your ancestors into your practice. And my practice and my path, like I said, I wasn't always doing that regularly for years. It's not something that is an essential tenet of my path or my practice, but it is something that I have done here and there over the years, just part of my life. And like I said, something that is becoming a little bit more involved. So I have broken up my notes about this into two categories, the first of which is the actual kind of my path-based stuff. So the fact that I'm a kind of Wiccan-based neo-pagan practitioner, and what does that mean and how does it apply to that? I'm going to put my notes right here so I can see them better. So few things that are involved in that sort of thing. Number one, of course, there is the Celtic-based neo-pagan Sabbath, one of our holidays, which is Samhain, which is the holiday where we honor our ancestors more often than not. and that is really the holiday that is set aside specifically for that. If you're not doing that all the time, which you may well be, that is specifically the honoring of the dead and those types of things. So there are a few traditions that I've taken from that, things that I've learned through that I now incorporate, such as the use of ancestor altars and setting up an altar specifically to honor your ancestors. Some people who have their ancestors as a big part of their practice all the time will have an ancestor altar permanently in their sacred space. I do not have one permanently, but I set it up as I do it. So for Samhain, I definitely do that kind of thing, and also anytime I want to specifically work with my ancestors for any other reason, I will bring that up and create an ancestor altar. And on that, I would put pictures of them, anything that used to belong to them, anything that reminds me of them, candles that are their favorite scent, their favorite foods, their favorite colors, anything that I know about them that will feel like invoking their presence is what would go on an ancestor altar for me. There are other traditions, of course, like I mentioned, that are much more heavily ancestor veneration centric, and in those traditions and in those cultures, there are specific ceremonies, specific rituals, specific altar setups and items and things that you would do. My path is not like that, so I'm just speaking from my experience because that's the only experience I have to speak from. So the next thing is telling stories. There's something that we do in Red Tent when we honor our ancestors is telling stories about them and telling stories about our family line as far as we know them. So if you have lost someone in your family and you knew them, you can tell some stories about when they were alive. And also, ancestors are typically thought of as just those who have passed beyond the veil, those who have passed on and are not currently living in this lifetime anymore. But really, your ancestors are also the people who are still alive. There's people who came before you. You don't have to wait until they're gone to honor them, of course. We should be honoring the people who are still alive and who we still have connections with as well. So my grandmother, though I am lucky enough to still have her in my life, she is one of my ancestors, and my mother as well. So they are my closest two generations of ancestors, even though they are still with me, thankfully. And then there's the ones beyond that who I will ask them for stories of the people who I don't know, that they know because they were around during that time and I wasn't. And the third thing is a very specific tradition that, it's not that specific. I just mean it's something that I specifically learned through studying things about Samhain over the years, and that is the concept of a dumb supper, or some people don't like the term dumb supper because it uses the word dumb meaning mute, meaning silent, that you don't speak during it in order to honor the dead. So an alternate name for that would just be to call it a silent meal or a silent dinner. And so that's something that I have started incorporating in my ancestor worship, and especially in my, or not worship, but in my ancestor honoring or veneration, and specifically in my Samhain practices. So for a dumb supper or a silent meal, silent dinner, whatever you want to call it, silent supper has the alliteration. It's not alliteration. Consonants? Anyway, terminology. That is a practice of sitting down to a meal, having everybody sit down to a meal during which you are silent, and setting places for your ancestors and places for the dead. And sometimes that is separate individual places for each one of them. Sometimes it is just one empty seat with the offering plate where you make them a plate as though you make one for yourself or anyone else who's enjoying the meal. You make them their plate, and that is the offering to the ancestors, and there's one seat to represent all of them. And typically it involves foods that are from your family's heritage, things that you've always made, things that you grew up with, or for me, it might involve, looking at the Italian side of my ancestry, the Irish side of my ancestry, and I believe there's some English in there too, or I know there's at least some, but I think that's another big one. So it would involve, picking out the specific Italian foods and the specific Irish foods and whatever else, and making that the basis of that meal and honoring your ancestors through it in silence. I really like that idea, so that's something I've been incorporating even though it's just me by myself. So it's literally just me and my ancestors. Nobody else comes over for those. And then the other side of my notes here that I wrote down is things that are just kind of from me and my current family, my family who are Catholic, and also just my path, the kind of eclectic things that I've picked up over the years that are things that I do or that my family has done to honor our ancestors. First thing on this list is lighting candles. Lighting candles is a big thing for pagans, certainly, but also for Catholics, and so I grew up with, we would go to church, and there's, in sort of the vestibule area before you get into the sanctuary, there is this giant rack, like a wrought iron thing of just tiers of candles, and you would put in a donation and you would light a candle for whoever you wanted to pray for, really. It doesn't have to be your ancestor. It can be friends who have passed on. It can be friends who are alive. It can be your animals, someone who's in the hospital, someone who's standing right next to you just because you want to pray for them, whatever it is. But more often than not, we would light a candle for my grandfather who had passed away when I was 4. So I grew up with, the number one practice of remembering him was lighting a candle for him at church. And when I was able to visit England and Wales in 2012 with my college group, when I went over there for 3 weeks for a study abroad course, we went to Bath, and some of my friends and I caught a concert, like an organ concert at Bath Abbey, and we did some exploring afterwards, and they had this giant thing of candles, and so we all decided to light a candle because I think one of my friends I was with is Episcopalian, and the other, I believe, also has Catholic family, although she is an atheist. So we all decided to light a candle, I think, or I know at least I did. So I lit a candle in the same area that I would have lit it at my family's home church. I picked the same basic candle in that area of the rack to light for my grandfather in Bath Abbey. So that's just a thing that my family does. Something else that my family has done when we have family reunions every year at a local park. There was one year, a few years ago, that they actually planted a tree, a memorial tree for my family, and there was this whole candle lighting ceremony that they came up with, so again, with the lighting of the candles for our ancestors, and a lot of people wrote little letters or poems or just thoughts of thanks and love and whatever. They wrote things down and then buried those under the tree. And I thought, oh my God, this is so pagan. This is so awesome. But that's something that my family had decided to do in honor of our ancestors, is plant this memorial tree and bury these words of love in the ground. And we stuck our candles in the ground all around it, and everybody had an opportunity to say something. So little things like that is stuff that my family has done, even though they are not pagan, and that's something that I still incorporate because, again, I view it as being very in tune with my path. It's very nature-based, lighting candles, I'm good with all that. Second thing on this list is items that my ancestors owned or used. This has always been a big thing because, like I said, my grandfather passed when I was 4, and these are my maternal grandparents, by the way. Did not know my father's side of the family. And my mother always had a few little items that belonged to her father, my grandfather. And over time, like one of the things that he would always keep in his pocket, kind of used it like a worry stone to rub on and kind of like a stress thing, was sometimes there would be a plastic piece left from the inside of like a milk jug or a water jug. You know how they're shaped and there's the handle and there's this kind of oblong section that gets punched out of the plastic to form the handle so that you can carry a jug of milk or water or juice or whatever it may be. And occasionally you would be able to find, or I don't know if my grandfather had his first one because he worked in a factory, or I don't know, because he worked for a brewery. But that plastic part would get punched out and you'd get your hands on one somehow. So my grandfather had one that he would keep in his pocket for years, and he used it like a worry stone. And when he passed on, my mother got it, and one day she got hold of another one and gave that to me. So it's not the original one that he had, but it's still something that was important to my grandfather. And, to this day, I still drink coffee the way my grandfather drank it, black with sugar, and you dip graham crackers in it. So things like that are ways that I consistently remember him. And, along with, like, the silent dinner things, I mentioned, putting their favorite foods on your ancestor altar or using their favorite foods in your dumb supper or silent dinner. There are specific favorite food things that I use and my family does to honor our ancestors. Again, this is specifically a grandpa thing. My grandfather loved the really crispy burnt French fries. So if we ever go to a fast food place or anywhere, even a restaurant, and there happens to be some of the really crispy burnt ones, not everybody likes the taste of those, but no matter what, ever since I was little, we always would still take those and just say, this one's for grandpa, and we'd eat it. Even if we don't like the taste of the burnt crispiness, which I know some of you out there are like, oh, that's the best part. And I know you're the kind of people who like to set your marshmallows on fire and just eat them completely black and crispy, which I have family members like that too. But yeah, even if we didn't like the taste of it, we would do it in honor of him. So that's just little stuff that I've grown up doing. And so now, that's my grandpa's stuff. Now I own some articles of clothing that belonged to my grandmother, and like I said, I'm lucky enough that she is still in my life at this time, but I already have some of those items, and when I wear them, it is in her honor. And when I go over to her house and I go out to dinner with her, I might take one of her sweaters out of her closet and I'll wear it out. I just like connecting with her in that way. So there are items like that. And I also, my father also is no longer among the living, and he, I believe at one point, I guess he cut hair or something, because my mother, after that point, gave me his old set of, hair cutting scissors, and they have his initials carved into them. So I have those wrapped up in a cloth and in a box somewhere among my space, among my things. So items that they owned are things that I personally hold on to. I don't know, I'm a witch and I'm a Catholic, right? We're all the relics and the stuff. So physical items are a big thing, and lighting candles. And the last thing I have here involves none of that stuff. This is the real minimalized ancestor veneration, and that is just that even without getting those things out, even without wearing the clothing, even without, making the food, nothing. Something really simple that I've been doing to just incorporate my ancestors more into my practice is just inviting them and calling them and invoking them along with all the other energies that I invoke into my circles and my meditations. I will say, I call upon my ancestors to be here with me now. I ask for your wisdom and guidance in, whatever I'm doing. So using that as just like any other thing that I would call deity, I would call elements, also just using that time and that format to welcome my ancestors to be with me in this time and space as well. Can be as simple as that. And really that's the main thing that I go for, because I'm not always lighting candles, I'm not always getting things out and all that other stuff. So simplest thing I do is just ask them to be present, And the last note that I wrote down was just, again, a reminder that there are other traditions that are really heavily ancestor-based, where you could look up those things and you would find very specific rituals and things that need to be done a certain way, and, whole specific ceremonies and holidays for the ancestors and for the sacred dead. And those are things that I absolutely love, but they are not strict elements, formalized, ceremonial type stuff within my practice. I'm very much a folk practitioner, kind of use what works. So that's what I would say is what I do. So if that gives any of you some ideas, if your practice happens to be kind of like mine, do what you can here and there, then I would absolutely recommend the lighting of candles, for sure. The use of things that belonged to them, or photographs, also work really well. I don't necessarily have photographs of all of my family members, but I do have family albums that my mom passed down to me that I like looking through and trying to identify who people were and things like that, and talking to any of your living ancestors and getting stories about them and just remembering, because what is remembered lives, right? So that is a huge thing. And like I said, just remembering to take that time to invite them into your life and into your practice and ask for their guidance the same way that you would ask for the guidance of the universe or any other spirit or whatever it is that you personally find meaning in. So that's my video for this week. Thank you for allowing me this space to talk about my ancestors, both living and dead, and I hope that gives you some ideas. And I'll see you next week to talk about the Fae, so that'll be exciting and different. And I'll see you then. Until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.